Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kevin Culver. I've been fully invited to discuss what you're seeing here on display on screen. I mentioned this a moment ago, but taxes and contracts and all the fun stuff that comes with that, not everyone's favorite topic in general, but even more so not the case when it's somewhat early in the morning and coffee's still kicking in. So I'll try to make this as engaging as possible. So with that in mind, as people come in, as people join, there will be a dedicated Q&A, but I don't necessarily like to wait until the end because sometimes you might have a question that pops up during a particular slide or particular way of describing something and you want more clarification in that moment. So I encourage you to raise a hand. Alejandro, if you can facilitate that, because when I'm in the zone, if I'm seeing a hand being raised, by all means, interrupt me and I'll make sure that question either is addressed or if it's something that needs to be discussed at length, and then we can certainly take it offline or move it to a separate discussion. But really, without further ado, uh, this particular presentation, while it's geared toward what I would say is smaller companies, smaller businesses, it's not particularly always the case, right? This has a wide range of applicability, and as we work through this presentation, you'll see why that's indeed the case. But we're going to be talking about Section 174, R&D tax credits. These are both separate pieces of the tax code, but very much interrelated. And then we'll talk a little bit about SBIR, STTR, and how that money transforms itself into R&D and research and experimentation expenses, which are fully deductible. Now, this presentation has really gotten a lot of traction, mostly because I would say, as a tax attorney, over the past, we'll say 3 or 4 years, it's as uh, fun as it could be. It's been a wild ride because we've had major legislative packages passed, not just at the federal level, but a lot of states have passed a lot of legislation that has really been applicable to this particular field of the tax code. So we had to really keep up. It's very rare in the tax space. So a lot of people want to know what's going on, and I want to do my best to explain that. So, without further ado, just a little bit about me. Uh, I've been working in this space for nearly a decade. I'm a licensed attorney, again, working and specializing in corporate tax, but particularly the R&D tax credit, and again, research and experimentation expenditures. And the reason this field requires such significant specialization is because, and we'll touch on this later on in the presentation, but there's often a lot of arguments and a lot of, well, I don't want to say disputes, but we'll call it somewhat of a gray area as to what is R&D, what is research, right? I'm doing survey research for my market, doing a market analysis surveying. Is that research, right? That we'll talk about what that all looks like and what can be properly classified. It's not always the case where it's purely black and white. So that's where my specialization comes in. But to that end, personally overseen, give or take, $750 million incentives across numerous companies over the past decades and across numerous industries, ranging from software to architecture, engineering, manufacturing, agriculture. So if you fall in any of these industries, or maybe even a subset of your business as a particular vertical, right? You could be a marketing company, but you're developing a software. Well, maybe that software project by itself is research and development. Marketing itself is not. So again, we'll touch on that here a little bit throughout this presentation. If I have to take breaks for drinking water, forgive me. There's a lot of dense content. Again, any questions that do come throughout this presentation, please let me know. And here at Royce Partners Limited, I'm actually calling you from Houston office. We're headquartered in Columbus. We also have a large presence in Albuquerque as we've expanded into the New Mexico market. Have my New Mexico State undergrad T-shirt on. You can see my New Mexico State undergrad degrees back there. So big fan of always giving back to my alumni, and as well as always love going back to Las Cruces for any green chili trips that I can get. But here at Royce Partners, we do specialize in this R&D tax credit. And the reason for that as well is because you can often think of CPAs being general practitioners. So I always draw this analogy where you go to your family doctor, right? You're going to see them once a year for a physical. Uh, should, always the case. But if you're going there and they detect a heart murmur or they detect a neurological issue, what that doctor is going to do is then refer you to a specialist, a cardiologist, a neurologist, so on and so forth. But by no means is the neurologist or cardiologist your new doctor. No, quite the contrary. Your doctor is just now a team. It requires a specialist to know the specific field medicine, but in this case, it's a specific field of the tax code. So very much the case where I'm partnered with many CPAs to do this particular aspect of this work for their clients, and then I provide that information to those CPAs so they can get that information filed on the tax returns correctly. So I'll pause there. Any questions about anything that I just described before I move on? Okay. Alejandro, again, I'm putting you on duty here if anybody has any hands raised or anything of the sort. So here's a quick agenda. We'll talk about a really high level funding overview about SBIR, STTR. If anybody's somewhat familiar, I'm not going to go too deep on this because it's relatively straightforward. But really what matters as it pertains to these contracts is, well, your company, your business, if they're winning these contracts, winning these awards under these particular programs, you are receiving money. Anytime you're receiving money in the United States, chances are there's a tax implication. Doesn't matter where it's sourced from, but there always needs to be a consideration. So we'll touch on that as well. Then we're going to hop into the R&D tax credit itself. We'll talk about what it means to qualify for the R&D tax credit. What's the threshold? What's the baseline test? Call out some examples. And jump between industries. And then we're also going to talk about how this has evolved over effectively the past, particularly couple of years. But I'll do a little bit of a history lesson. And I would say that's somewhat of the boring part, but you'd be surprised because when you really peel all the layers back of how we got to where we are today as it pertains to R&D, it's really been a fascinating development over the course of, give or take, 50 years. Um, and then we'll go ahead and talk about just a baseline practical example, a quick case study, right? What kind of company received what kind of dollar amounts, and then of course, final thoughts that I have, and it'll lend itself to another pause for Q&A. So let's jump right into it. So for those that are unaware of what SBI or STTR funding is, this is non-dilutive federal funding for small businesses. It's very key for those of you that don't know what diluted means or non-dilutive. It just means, hey, you're receiving funds without having to give up equity, right? This is contrasted with companies who maybe receive capital from an outside venture capital firm, a private equity firm. They're typically going to want to take a piece, so to speak, of the company's equity, with hope that it's going to pay off in the future. But in this case, these are federal funds that are provided to businesses that does not require any equity or ownership to be given up to receive them. So they're very beneficial in that way, and it can really get the company kind of boots off the ground, get started with, again, any fear that you're beholden to private equity or venture capital asking for immediate gains. This is going to be types of contracts or funding, I should say, that come from a wide range of federal agencies. Some examples are listed there: DoD, National Institute of Health, so on and so forth, Department of Energy, NASA. Worked with companies that have had contracts, I think, with every single federal agency that is capable of providing an SBIR contract. How this traditionally looks is these types of SBIR contracts or STTR contracts structured in phases. Phase one is going to be a proof of concept. This range, as you're seeing there, it's nothing to scoff at. It's enough typically to get a company to very much get to a solid proof of concept. And of course, if the proof of concept meets the criteria that that particular contract is calling for, then the government ideally gets you to phase two. Money significantly increases. Let's take this proof of concept, let's make it a full-fledged R&D dedicated effort, but ideally a project, or rather, I should say final product. The product can be software. So in that case, it can be intangible all the way to a manufacturing or engineered product. And of course, phase three, this is commercialization. This isn't typically a contract the government necessarily awards, but what we often see is, this is a very, we'll call it wide example or a very specific example. And the reason I'm calling it out is because there's a specific case on this. But Lockheed Martin, right, they have a contract with the Department of Defense and they develop weapons, missiles for them. And a lot of the technology that they develop is, of course, not just proprietary, but they're working in tandem with the DoD. So the DoD's research team is providing them insights. To that end, they want some control over the commercialization. Hey, do we want the technology that we developed on the open market, right? That's where the commercialization can, we'll say, limit whether or not you can put that product on the market, but not all the time. And I would say in most cases, that's actually not what occurs. The government in these cases typically does not really, for lack of a better term, care too much about how you're commercializing these products. They just want to see innovation continue because this spurs more marketplace activity. Whether you're a small company, a mid-sized company, those direct competitors are going to see your innovation. They naturally are going to want to have to innovate, I should say, to keep up with you, keep up with their competitor. And that's going to continuously move the needle from an innovation standpoint, which again spurs economic activity. Again, the key advantage, right, kind of alluded to this, but when you're receiving these types of contracts, you retain 100% equity. Of course, if in your company, your partner, your multiple shareholders, you all have your portions of equity, your portions of shares. But as it pertains to receiving these contracts, no one's giving up the equity, which is always favorable. Any questions on this before I move on? Okay.
Hey, Kevin. Excuse me,
Yeah.
Mark Fidel here. Real
Yes.
quick, thank you for this
Yeah.
overview. Obviously, there's success criteria, I've got
Yes.
to assume,
Yes.
tied to this because this kind of money has strings attached,
Right.
right?
Yes.
But the
Very much.
important thing that you're highlighting is that there's no dilution to the entity receiving the money.
Correct.
Okay, got it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
That is correct. Yeah, and we're going to talk about how it works as it applies to the contractual structure itself, because to your point, Mark, it's our strings attached. Um, I would say for phase one, when it comes to proof of concept, um, for lack of better terms, there's less strings, but
Sure.
generally want to bring something to what the particular agency is calling for and say, hey, we think we can do this, and they're going to ideally reward you to figure that out. Of course, if you can get
Okay.
through phase one, then great, let's get to phase two, and that's why we see a spike in central funds.
Are you gonna? Thank you. Are you going to talk about how to categorize the incoming funds from an accounting
Yes,
perspective?
yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that.
No problem. Thanks.
About it, of course. Great question. And when we get there as well, Mark, if you have any additional questions, feel free to jump in on that. So why is it better for startups, right? Because a lot of startups, it, they start just from here, right? They start out, they have this idea, and they want to bring it to a particular federal agency and win that award because they're giving up any equity in doing so, as opposed to bringing it to potential angel investors, bringing it to venture capital, equity, so on and so forth. Um, and again, it validates the technology while simultaneously de-risking. And the risk that's being de-risked in this case is because you are not giving up equity. So if now suddenly someone sees your development efforts occur and they want to issue you some money, they're going to want equity. Well, now that there's no other investors involved, again, it's de-risking it, right? They're more inclined to jump in with you, if you will, because they're not sharing a piece of that pie. They can potentially get a big chunk, so to speak. On top of that, again, with startups, this kind of money, it really funds those initial core R&D activities, again, without giving up ownership. And it can also be combined. I did mention this multiple times already when it comes to venture capital. Angel investment can occur here as well. So you're not just limited. Oh, I want an SBIR contract. I can't get funding from other other sources. That's not the case at all. It can absolutely be the case where you're receiving funny money from multiple different funnels. Maybe the SBIR contract is your largest one, but it's maybe half of the capital that you're utilizing for development efforts. So again, it doesn't preclude you from seeking sources of income or sources of funding from any other source. On top of that, though, I think this often gets overlooked, is it gives credibility, right? If I'm looking at a startup and they get to phase one and they're in phase two of commercial or of development efforts, and that's with the Department of Defense, uh, their potential competitors are going to look at that, or even other potential investors are going to be looking at that and going, wow, if the DoD is saying they're capable of doing this, then I'm going to take a second look, right? I'm curious as to what they're doing because the DoD, amongst many other agencies, have no shortage of smart and intelligent people who can do a lot of critical and complex work. So again, if you can do that, it certainly invites essentially good marketing efforts, but on top of that, boosts credibility of the startup itself, which is often a really limiting factor for startups is getting that natural credibility. What makes you different? How do you get your brand out there? Again, this is a great way to do that. But shifting right to the tax reality, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, anytime you receive income, it's going to be taxable. Um, Whether or not it is ultimately taxable comes down to a question of whether the company is profitable. It's always key here to remember the fact that you are only taxed on your profits, right? So if you receive $1 million in funding and you spend $1 million in salaries, well, your profit is zero, right? And so you're not being taxed on that. A lot of companies, especially early stage startups, they often run into what we refer to as losses. In other words, they're spending more than they're making, um, so there's no tax to be paid. But inevitably, and hopefully, the goal is commercialize their product or products, and ultimately leads to profit, which again, they're ultimately taxed on. Those are the benefits of the R&D tax credits can really come in as well. So to that end, understanding these tax implications a little bit more closely, as well as being strategic about it, perhaps forecasting whether or not you are going to be eligible for the R&D credit, whether or not you can deduct certain expenditures as it pertains to research and experimentation. It's absolutely necessary to understand that because when it comes to startups, the, the universal term is thrown out there all the time is how much runway do we have, right? Paying 5 engineers and the total payrolls equating to again $1 million, and I have $1.2 million in the bank account. Well, we also to account for rent, we need to account for other overhead pieces. So how long can the business survive under that particular dollar amount if the other funding is granted, if no other sources of income are derived? And so again, very key to understand this, you can properly forecast the future of the company itself. So pause there. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay. So let's talk about the history of the R&D credit. This can get a little bit extensive, but I'm going to try to be as brief as I can. But I think, again, it's important to understand the very framework that we're operating in here. So back in the early 50s, post World War II, we saw kind of a big boom of companies going on the marketplace. And so there's a lot of innovation happening simultaneously. And to that end, anytime you're innovating, there's a lot of risk going on there because I'm going to invest money into something that may ultimately fail, right? It may be something that I work on for 6 months and just can't get it to do the thing I want it to do. Sorry, Mark, were you going to say something? Good. So in the early 50s, Congress recognized this and they said, look, if you are spending and allocating funds as it pertains to developing anything that's deemed innovative under Section 174 of the tax code, which is research and experimentation, you can go ahead and take a full 100% deduction on the year incurred. You can also spread those expenses out over 5 years. I don't want to say it's a dealer's choice, but sometimes there's unique accounting methods that occur. What's most important is, again, if you are doing research and experimentation, you can then go ahead and take 100% deduction on that particular capital that's being spent in the year incurred. So again, if you spent $500,000 on research and experimentation, then you can take $500,000 as a deduction under Section 174 of the tax code. Then in the 80s, what was happening is right around the Reagan administration, we started to see what we refer to today as often globalization, a lot of jobs in manufacturing being outsourced to China, other countries as well. So we're seeing kind of this reduced innovative investment domestically. And so in that particular administration created what's referred to as the R&D credit. It's formally called the credit for increasing research activities. In other words, you're investing in more and more R&D work. And in doing so, if you're doing it domestically, you can be rewarded in the form of tax credits. So to take that as one step further, we're developing a product and our profit at the end of the year is $100,000. There's an R&D credit for $100,000 that I'm sitting on, my new tax bill is zero, despite the fact that I had 100,000 in profit. So it was a great way to incentivize domestic investment there when it comes to research and development. This was something that was continuously, extended year over year, as Congress likes to do, to make it permanent. So to hold it over other people's heads as administrations change. And as we move forward, what happened in 2004 is the Treasury, under Directive 9104, what they said is, hey, let's get rid of what we refer to as the discovery rule. And what this has to do with is in the 80s, when the R&D credit was effectively enacted from a legislative standpoint, it really limited it only to companies that were doing what I would refer to as patentable work, right? New work that's new to the world. So pharmaceutical companies, product developers that, again, are doing things in that typically patent. But in 2004, the Treasury recognized the fact that what if companies that, as opposed to being new to the world, it's new to the company, right? So, I talked about Lockheed Martin here as an early example, but I'm going to use just myself as a cherry example. I'm developing a software product. My direct competitor is not Meta, it's not Google. I can't compete with them. Maybe my direct competitor is a small software shop that's doing something similar to me, down the street. I'm innovating, I'm doing something new for my company. So my direct competitor is now looking at me saying, well, I got to keep up with Kevin. I have to keep up with their business. And then again, that spurs continuous innovative effort. And maybe that lends itself to patentable work. Not always the case. Nonetheless, this spurs, again, innovation across all sectors, particularly the small and mediums as well. So to restate that, 2004, they got rid of what we refer to as new to the world, but rather it needs to be new to the company. And that's sufficient for being quote unquote R&D in this case. Then in 2015, under the CARES Act, during the Obama administration, the R&D credit was made permanent part of the tax code. The part of the tax code can be found under Section 41. And so this led to a lot of, I would say, a big boost in whether or not companies were claiming R&D, and primarily because since it was potential that the R&D credits could expire, maybe it was going to quote unquote run out in the next year, it had companies struggling to forecast whether or not they could rely on those credits to offset some of their tax implications. But following 2015, now that the R&D credit's permanent, this provided a lot of marketplace certainty, which is certainly needed about these very credits that are extremely lucrative. And then we get to 2017. So this is during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. This is what was passed was the Tax Cuts and Job Act, often referred to as TCJA. And this changed a lot. So what the Tax Cuts and Job Act did was they reduced corporate tax rates significantly. So for a quick reflexive example is depending on entity structure, they were taxed at a certain level. And in this case, we'll talk about a C Corp. These are all publicly traded corporations or C Corps, just to be clear. They were taxed at 34%. So if you made $1 million in profit, you were taxed at $350,000 bill. But What this did is, under this tax bill, it reduced that 35% taxable effective tax rate for C Corps to 21%. So it's a significant decrease, right? Anytime you're decreasing tax rates, you do need to offset. You've got to balance the books for it to the legislative chambers that be. The way they did this was a multitude of ways. We'll go into a 1,000-page tax bill, but what was particularly unique was the fact that they started so 2022 in this bill. They said, look, these R&D expenses now have to be amortized. In other words, if you spend $1 million in R&D, you can't take that 100% deduction. You can only take 10% of that deduction. So now I can only take a $100,000 deduction and I'm left over $100,000. And this is going to be effectively categorized as income. This was very impactful to a lot of small and medium-sized businesses because this created what I refer to as phantom income, and ultimately leading to a larger tax bill that they may or may not have the ability to pay. That was their way of paying the bills. Uh, when I say paying the bills, I mean paying the adjusted corporate tax rates under this legislation. On top of that, 5-year spread out of amortization, we refer to it. It also required a 15-year amortization if the research was done overseas. So if you were outsourcing, you see this typically in software, you're outsourcing development efforts to overseas, in India, then those expenses have to be spread out over 15 years. In other words, you can only take a 6.5% reduction on whatever the spend may be. Again, significantly reducing the favorability of what the previous 50 years of research and experimentation investment led to. Full disclosure there, this was a very, very difficult time for a lot of businesses that had not just contracts commercially, but government contracts necessitated innovation. Right? It's significantly modified their tax bills, significantly modified how they were categorizing costs. And there was a lot of confusion about how to treat certain expenditures. There was certainly a lot of guidance provided, but again, it was a tricky time. We'll kind of leave it there. And then in 2021, uh, you know, also when it comes to tax returns, you can always go back and amend your tax returns to claim R&D credits and claim certain deductions that you didn't realize. Maybe it's the first time you're even hearing about this during this presentation. So companies could go back and claim this. But in 2021, the IRS rolled out additional guidance saying, hey, if you're going back and making these claims, you need to provide what we refer to as contemporaneous documentation. Show me, I know you missed out, but show me the documentation that meets the criteria of R&D. But it's kind of a significant change in place because some companies claim they're doing R&D, but if they're not documenting it, really no documentation at all, it can get a little bit more complicated to make the claim itself. But in 2022, those rules of amortization, they all triggered. I don't know if you all remember, but somewhere around 2020, something happened, right? Was COVID. We saw a lot of major tax legislation pass. The American Jobs Rescue Act, so on and so forth. And this amortization rule that was getting a lot of attention, tax tax groups respectively said, hey, this needs to be fixed before 2022. It kind of all got shelved. We really were focused on keeping the economy as stable as we could during a very unprecedented time. So effectively, it got tabled, and that led to a lot of uncertainty over, I would say, give or take 3 or so tax years. Fortunately, in 2025, this was last year in July, we had what we refer to as the One Big Beautiful Bill, often referred to as OB3. This said, look, we recognize that this is a significant tax burden, especially so for small, medium-sized businesses. So we're going to go ahead and fix it. And it is incredibly rare, as an attorney as well, to see retroactive legislation. Typically, anytime you see legislation pass, it's only going to be prospective. Anything going forward, because there was so much to be unwound. The One Big Beautiful Bill said, hey, anybody with domestic organization requirements now, you can go ahead and go back and fix it. And we'll talk about what that looks like here in a moment. But what did remain is the 15-year amortization requirement for foreign investment. So what they're trying to incentivize, again, is domestic investment when it comes to research and development, which, funny enough, takes you all the way back to 1981. Was the original intent to incentivize domestic R&D jobs because they're typically highly paid and benefit the U.S. economy significantly. So the foreign rule there, anything over the U.S., uh, anything overseas that's non-U.S., those expenses now still have to be spread out over 15 years. So that can dictate whether or not you're considering sourcing any particular aspects of development overseas. So as I said, this section's a little bit dense, so I'll pause here. Questions on kind of the timeline here. Okay. Moving on to the next slide, it kind of restates a few things that I had said, but given the fact that the R&D credit was enacted in 1981, there's always going to be numerous legal challenges to what is R&D, what's the legal criteria. It's led to give or take 50 court opinions that are out there, likely more about 75. In fact, there's one right now with Facebook for an R&D claim they made in 2004. That's currently being litigated at the court level, at the IRS level right now. So the landscape's always evolving when it comes to what does it mean for R&D, what's sufficient documentation, if you're under contract, being paid to do this work, can I make this claim? Uh, this is all there. And then as well as things like executive compensation. Hey, I'm paying someone a significant sum of money. They're doing all this R&D. Well, that's going to naturally boost your credit. So these court cases touch on all these subjects. But again, some other things that we saw in this timeline in 2015, as I mentioned in the previous slide, when this R&D tax credit was made permanent, we saw kind of a lot of pop-up shops. Hey, there's a credit, go out there and get it. It's also led to, say, unsubstantiated claims. And so that's when you saw the IRS requiring contemporaneous documentation being submitted alongside your return, particularly for amended returns, to say, show me that you qualify for this R&D, to stop what they were seeing kind of pop up following the making the R&D tax credit. Some other historical impacts that I touched on is Section 174, the amortization rules. There's a lot of chatter, a lot of murmurs saying, hey, this needs to get fixed before 2022. Code came along. There was quite a few proposals. Time you had a different majority in the Senate versus the House. So as politics unfold, and as they do, it's hard to give somebody a win. So things are second way. So those bills didn't move the way they should have. And again, it led to some very, I would say, unpredictability when it comes to how these expenses were treated. Again, the last thing I'll say is these changes are always evolving. As I just mentioned, there's cases that are ongoing right now, and how and what we deem R&D is always evolving from continuous IRS guidance. Especially, I would say, this is kind of nothing's out there yet, but a deep hunch here. We will see some guidance from the IRS being issued, particularly the Treasury, about the usage of AI. Because as companies integrate AI into their existing systems, they generally are saying this is R&D. Is it right? Is it R&D to use another software tool that now more or less is providing prompts and can now just write emails faster or do marketing faster? Is that R&D? So I suspect we'll see some guidance there. But again, that's a bit of a sidebar. So I'll pause here. Any questions?
Is there any current list or categorization or anything, a tool that describes what qualifies as R&D under the current rules?
Oh, check out this next slide. You got me. It's answering right there. So right in the money. So I'll try to touch on this here in depth, but to your question, Trisha, that whatever I describe here as well, there can always be some nuance, right? So I want to be clear, this is not black and white. But you got to remember, lawyers like myself, we wrote the tax code, so we wrote it in a way to keep it in a position where I can argue about it. So the ambiguity here is often there, but I think this provides pretty sufficient clarity. We'll touch on it as we go through this. So again, what is R&D? It's an incentive designed to encourage American businesses to invest in innovation. And it allows these companies to receive dollar for dollar tax offsets. To be clear, tax credits are always, always more lucrative than deductions, because if you receive a $100,000 tax credit, you're generally getting $100,000 in tax offsets versus a deduction where that's just reducing your overall taxable income. So you're still being taxed just a little bit less. So always want to point that out. So how does R&D work? Well, it's what we also refer to as an activities-based credit. What activities are you doing? Are those activities deemed R&D? Can they be classified as R&D? What kind of expenses can we capture for R&D? Wages. These are going to be employees that are paid for doing R&D. Again, touching here momentarily. Raw materials. This often comes in the form of manufacturers, where we see them buy some equipment. They need to do some prototyping. You need to figure it out, for lack of a better term. They can't do it without the raw materials. And those materials can be classified as prototypes, and therefore those can be in the R&D bucket, so to speak. Any outside contractors. Maybe you have to bring in a specialist for a one-off project. Maybe you have a team of 10 contractors that are used because right now you're not in the position to put them employees, classify them as employees. But I do want to point out here, when it comes to contractors, they do need to be doing this work domestically, right? If you're outsourcing overseas, that's not an eligible expense. And then last but not least is cloud hosting. So typically we see this is kind of analogous to the manufacturing prototype example, is where software companies will spend money on AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and they do all their software work on this, and they have what we refer to as production environment. This would be the environment we interface with as consumers. They're going to have what we refer to as a demo environment. This is where they test new functionality, new code, deploy it there, make sure it works. Because if they deploy it in the production environment, well, it may cause a lot of issues for consumers like us. So this is where they do all their test code. So the portion of hosting that is non-production related, that can be classified as R&D as well. You can claim this credit every single year as long as the activities that you're conducting are deemed R&D. As I mentioned earlier, if you were completely unaware of this, you can go back up to 3 years and claim these R&D credits. Maybe even get refunds because you overpaid your taxes because you were unaware that you were entitled to this credit. Some states actually permit, California is one example, they let you go back 4 years. I think that probably is a little bit of Silicon Valley lobbying, but they let you go back 4 years because California has pretty high taxable rates. And then some other key considerations here. There's specific exclusions, one of them being overseas work, one of them being what we refer to as funded research, the fun world of contracts, as well as what we call seasonal changes. Hey, I have this product, how I made it winter adjacent, maybe changing the color. That's not a sufficient change for R&D. So there are specific exclusions that the IRS calls out in R&D. And then last but not least, Section 41, which is where you find the R&D tax credit, is how we determine the criteria for the credit, whereas Section 174, that's sort of the big brother, if you will, to the R&D credit. It has to do with deductions, how can reduce our taxable income. It's a little bit broader than Section 41. I promise you this will make a little bit more sense as we jump into the subsequent slides. So any questions before I move on?
Kevin, Mark, Fidel,
Yeah.
again, quick question.
Yeah.
If I may. The R&D tax credit is not tied one for one for any SBIR grant dollars. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So if my company, as an example, receives $250,000 in an SBIR grant, right? But I also have other sources of income that allows me to spend a total of $4 million in R&D,
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
My tax credits should include that 250 if applicable, plus the additional up to 4 million
Uh, yeah, the answer
in my
is
real
yes.
simple scenario. All
In
right.
your real simple, yeah, your real simple scenario, if you're using that $250,000 is granted to you for software development engineers' salaries on your software product
Right.
development, that can absolutely all be classified as R&D. Depending on how the
Okay.
contract's structured, we'll touch on that. But also, yeah, that 4 million can absolutely be categorized. But if of that 4 million, let's call it a million is overhead, right? Rent for the
Sure.
office. It's not going to be part of the specification, of
Understood. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
course. Um, so I think you'll like this next slide, Tricia. Uh, this here is found in section 41 of the tax code. This is the criteria. We call it the four-part test colloquially, about whether or not the project the company is doing um, is that R&D eligible. To be clear, every single project the company is doing has to be subjected to this test and effectively pass this test. So you can imagine very large companies have thousands and thousands of R&D projects going on in a single year. And those projects carry over and span over multiple years. And some companies in the startup phases in particular, they're working on one product, maybe two. Do those two products meet the criteria that's listed here? So let's walk through this together. The first part of the test asks, is this a new or improved business component? Now, the business component, one of these things. Business components either product, it's process, it's formula, invention, software, or technique. If it's any of those things, it is business component, to be clear. That is what we mean by new or improved business component. But what I also want to highlight here is the term or, right? So you can be developing a new product, but you may have an existing product that you are now seeking to improve. That may be sufficient for passing the test. So don't feel like, oh, well, we already have this product. It's not the window. No, tell me a little bit more about what you're doing. You can think about it like, I think software is always a good example. Like, Instagram, Facebook, all these things looked a lot different 5 years ago, 10 years ago than they do now. They're still Facebook, they're still Instagram, right? They were improving their existing product. Um, but these improvements or this development effort has to be what we refer to as, it has to be conducted for what's referred to as a permitted purpose. Permitted purpose is going to be either functionality, reliability, quality, or performance. So if I'm developing a new product, a new process, or I'm improving a new product or process, so on and so forth, if it's any of those permitted purposes, does not need to be all four. One is sufficient. Needs to be for a quality improvement, quality change, reliability change, performance improvement, and a functionality improvement. If it meets any of those, it's going to be a permitted purpose, and we'll check off that. So let's just use a baseline example. I'm developing a software, developed it last year. This year I'm working on making it capable of integrating with new systems. So an existing product, now I'm improving the functionality of that product because now I can integrate said system. It's a continuous improvement, and therefore it's meeting a permitted purpose, and we can throw a check mark on the first part of that test. Any questions on the first part of that test there? Okay. The next part is what we refer to as elimination of uncertainty. And to be clear, when I say we, collectively speaking on behalf of the Treasury regulations and the IRS as well, I often throw a word in here. I like to call it elimination of technical uncertainty. Because to a degree, I think all companies are uncertain when they're investing or seeking to develop something. And what I think they often mean, if lost in translation, is there's economic uncertainty. Is this going to pay off? So the question fundamentally is there uncertainty as to the capability to achieve this design, right? Is there uncertainty as to the method? How am I going to get there? How are we going to get these materials to integrate? What's the appropriate method? Or am I uncertain as to the overall design, right? In developing the software to integrate with a new system, what is the design of the software such that it has that new capability, such that it reads the data properly? If you're uncertain as to any of those things, then you're meeting the second part of the test. And I often like to point out here is you don't necessarily think these development efforts in this way, right? Uh, you may be just doing the work and you're not realizing it. You're figuring things out. It lends itself to the third part of the test, process of experimentation, right? And simply put, it's just, are you evaluating one or more alternatives, right? If you are seeking to develop a new product, which is your business component, going to do functionality improvement, your permitted purpose. If I'm uncertain as to the design of achieving that, there's your second part of the test. How am I going about figuring that out? How am I iterating upon it? How am I running? Am I doing test runs? Is it the scientific method? Is it just kind of throwing test code at a wall? Right? This is all different types of process of experimentation. And the reason it's kind of broad here is because it varies by industry. Software develops versus how engineers and manufacturers develop. They're going to do maybe drawings and red lines. Software testing is going to be deployed and see what it does to the system. It's all process of experimentation. We're figuring out to overcome technical uncertainty that we're experiencing. So I'll pause there. Any questions on that?
Yeah, in the experimentation process, like I have developed adult education product that I am wanting to test as a standalone journal, and then
Mhm.
with instruction. And so would that qualify as in any of these categories as different conditions?
Yeah, I think there's something there. I mean, it's something I would want to dig into because there's a difference between kind of putting together a baseline training, which is full effectively just content driven, versus I am putting this together so this can be capable of rolled out to different software systems or being readable on different operating systems, so on and so forth. So we want to dig into it a little bit more to make sure that it's meeting this criteria as closely as possible. The process of experimentation you may be experiencing is, how is this going to actually integrate? How is this actually going to do the thing I want it to do, for lack of a better term? And again, that goes to my point of, you may not be asking yourself these questions in real time. When I systematically unwind it with you, almost like an interview, you may not realize how much technical work is going into it. So, it's a broad answer, but as all lawyers like to say, it depends. But by no means is that a hard disqualification.
Sure. Well, I'm testing for efficacy, and I guess I'm just curious how that differentiates from like being seen as a marketing
Efficacy,
activity. Yes,
I
so I'm
think,
trying to see if it works as a standalone or if it works better in conjunction with another element. And I really want to elicit feedback again to test it for its efficacy. And I'm wondering, I always kind of thought of
yeah,
that as a marketing
sure.
activity, but it really is more my research and development. So there's a little bit of confusion.
Yeah, no, I think what you're describing from an efficacy standpoint is lends itself to maybe a quality improvement, which is a permitted purpose, right, of your overall design. To your point, if you're testing it for efficacy, then you're probably uncertain as to the design of this, right? Because you want it to meet the efficacy standard. How are you getting there? Well, you're taking marketplace feedback, you're trying new technologies, whatever it may be. I'm making a few things up and assumptions here. Lends itself to the potential R&D qualification to be clear. But great question. The last part of this test is what I refer to as the easiest part of the test is this project rooted in hard sciences, right? And so effectively what we're looking for is it repeatable? So this is generally going to exclude what we refer to as soft sciences, sociology, philosophy is a good one, psychology. And the reason for that is because we can do a very sophisticated sociological analysis, publish a paper that is award winning, but based on my sample size, change a variable in there, it's not the same result versus a mathematical formula, E equals MC squared. Or if I'm doing computer science, if I make a conditional if then this, it's repeatable. It's going to consistently happen every single time. So as long as that project itself is rooted in hard sciences, and just your point, for that you're doing is rooted in hard sciences to figure out that overall design, then it's going to meet the fourth criteria.
Okay, even if the initial product is rooted in social science like psychology.
Yeah, not unusual at all. I've worked with marketing companies, in particular, very large ones, that 90% of their business model is innovative marketing strategies, so on and so forth. We exclude all that. And a subset of there is that they have a team that is dedicated to data analytics, are developing tools to funnel in to their marketing systems for proper analysis. And that data collections and analytics model that they're making, well, it's an R&D project, kind of a sub project inside their company. So it's very much the case that we see companies on their face may not look like an R&D eligible company, but the more we look under the hood, so to speak, there's something more there. So they start from soft science, which doesn't bode well, but then it churns into something that lends itself to hard sciences. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Trisha? Is that good? Okay. So again, kind of to restate this, four-part test, every project is subjected to it. If projects qualify, well, then the fun part is to happen. And that is what expenses can I capture toward this? So if I have an eligible project, projects, first thing we always look at, and the reason I do this is because I often refer to as the R&D credit as a wage-driven credit. So who's involved? Who's directly doing this work? Not just that. Who's overseeing this and who's supporting this? So Treasury regulations actually have a great example of this. Uh, you can imagine a chemist in a laboratory. They're conducting an experiment. They're hands-on. But in that same laboratory, you have a lab assistant who's taking notes, cleaning the beakers, making sure that things are uh, quote unquote occurring the way the chemist needs them to happen so they can execute that experiment. And then over that chemist, you're going to have the professor. They following guidelines. They properly doing X, Y, and Z to effectively this experiment peer reviewed, right? Each party in the example is integral to the success or failure of the experiment. So to that end, a portion of the time that's oversight, a portion of the time that's directly doing it, and a portion of the time that's directly supporting it, it's all R&D eligible as wage categorization. We often call this the one up, one down rule. One up from the chemist, one down from the chemist. We can't get too attenuated. We can't say, well, the janitor cleans the lab that they work in. That's too far removed from the individual or individuals who are directly doing the work. So to that end, it's very much an expanded credit when it comes to wages. You see, again, wages have to be domestic. I always want to point that out. And then any questions on wages there? Move on. One more thing I'll add here when it comes to wages is it's also not unusual to see individuals who their time is effectively all R&D. It's all they do, and if they're allocated at 80% or more, being totally referred to as substantially all their time is R&D. And what that really means is 100% of their wage can then be categorized as an R&D expense that goes toward the total credit calculation. So if you're paying someone $100,000, 80% of their time is R&D, all $100,000 is R&D expenditures and R&D credit eligible. So it's quite significant. And a lot of companies say, well, I don't use time tracking, I don't, have any systems like that. That's okay. The IRS is completely aware that all companies are different sizes, especially startups. We can always use reasonable estimates. We can have interviews. Tricia, I would interview you, for example, and say, tell me about how you spend your time. Right? On average, what's your day look like? Well, half my time is this, half my time is that. What we're excluding is general administrative, personnel oversight. Those are things that we're going to exclude. But because you're the person that can speak to this, we can get understanding. In larger organizations, they may not have time tracking systems. So I interview the supervisor of that department, right? Tell me about what your team does. How do they spend their time? What we care about here is reasonable estimates, right? I'm not going to ask the company's CPA, how's everyone spending their time? They're not in the R&D world. They're not, boots in the ground, so to speak. So we can't take those estimates because they, for lack of better terms, they're not reasonable. So again, if you have no time tracking mechanisms, by no means are you precluded from claiming this if you're eligible. But the next category of expenses is, of course, outside contractors. So if you bring in contractors to assist you with some of the work, maybe it's for a one-off project. Maybe if you have a long-standing contractor relationship and you're paying them for assisting you on their work, with their work. The one caveat here, though, is when it comes to contractors, because they're not employees, they do have a limitation where it's up to 65%. So I pay a contractor $100,000 to do R&D eligible work, and 100% of the time is strictly R&D. The maximum amount that you can capture for them is 65,000. And the reason for that is because you're not paying payroll taxes on a contractor the same way you are on your employees. So it's kind of the IRS's way of saying, okay, we'll let you have that, but we're going to haircut it a little bit to make sure, we're all made whole. And then, of course, supplies and raw materials, very big in the manufacturing and agriculture space. You typically have to buy a lot of materials to do prototype first article runs. I would hope that pharmaceutical companies are doing test batches before they send it to commercialization. It can often lend itself to significant stuff to ultimately get to the commercialization and green light effort, or the green light status, if you will. And those expenses can all be categorized as R&D as well. Where those lines are drawn, again, are through discussion. At what point did it become commercialized? At what point did it pass quality testing? So on and so forth. Those are through discussions. It's again black and white scenario. And then last but not least, I'll touch on it again, is the cloud hosting expenses. Typically don't see these being significant spend. Every dollar counts, I always say. So when working with software companies, I've seen some that maybe in total there's give or take 5,000 to 8,000 they spent on cloud hosting in a given year. And of that, 40% is demo environments. So it's not that much relative to wages and contractors. Every dollar counts here when it comes to categorization of expenses, because it can either be deducted or it's, of course, going to contribute to the calculation itself. So I know there's a lot of information when it comes to expenses here that are categorized toward R&D. But any questions on this? I'm also using this as a moment to drink water, so. Okay. We're about to change gears here for a moment and talk about contracts themselves and what it means for what we refer to as a funding analysis. This part can get a little bit nuanced because it kind of requires a bit of a legal framework. Together a neat graphic. Let's quick slides to ideally give you an idea of how this functions. And this will very much be applicable to companies who are taking SBIR contracts because some SBIR contracts don't meet the criteria that lends itself to R&D qualification, whereas some do. And that there's an independent analysis upon each contract. So here, the funding analysis for contract research. What we're really looking for here is research, is it contingent upon the success of the research? This is legalese for, am I going to get paid if fail, right? The answer, if it's no, then you're good. If the answer is yes, then that's what we typically refer to as funded research. So how this effectively works is, we'll see in this next slide here. I don't want to run through this because I think the next slide does a better job of explaining this. So what kind of contracts are more risky versus risky, right? And when it comes to R&D claims, I may have a project that I'm doing, right, that is meeting that 4-part test. The very nature of the project is under contract. I started that project under a contract, under an SBIR contract. If that contract is set up in a fixed fee, a flat fee, a single lump sum payment, this is an economically risky contract. And the reason for that is because it's milestone driven, for example. I'm developing a new product for the DoD. And it says, once you send me prototype 1, you'll get your first $40,000 payment. Well, I'm also saying is, if you don't give me the prototype, I'm paying you anything, right? That's a risky contract because if you have to spend $50,000 to get that prototype out to them, it's the risk on you because essentially you can't meet that milestone to achieve payments. Same goes for lump sum. The only difference with lump sum and fixed fee contracts is lump sums typically just paid in one final payment once you deliver the product versus fixed fee. Typically see this, kind of phases, phase one, phase two, phase three, so on and so forth. Those are what we call risky and traditionally risky contracts. Some SBIR contracts lend themselves this way, whereas some contracts with SBIR will go the other way and be what we refer to as not economically risky, time and material contracts. So, for example, if the same exact setup is, hey, develop me this prototype, I'll pay you $100 an hour to do it. 3 months later, Trisha, I'm gonna keep picking on you, but Trisha says, you know what, I can't do it. Well, the whole time I was paying Trisha her monthly or her weekly invoice for the hours she spent, and then she said she couldn't do it, so I have to get somebody else to do it. But I lost the money. It was economically risky for me because she wasn't required to be successful to receive payment. She didn't achieve that prototype. She didn't achieve the product that we were seeking, but nonetheless, she still got paid. Again, converse this with the fixed fee setup where only pay you if you achieve the milestone of delivering me that product, because otherwise I'm not paying you. So that's what we see here when it comes to SBIR contracts and how they're set up. There's a variation. So I'll look. So pause there. This lends itself to a lot of questions typically. So any questions on this? Okay. Right here in the middle is one of the fun parts. You kind of have the sweet spot contracts, and these are what we refer to as NTE or GMP contracts, not to exceed, guaranteed minimum price. So same example, developing a product. Um, Trisha, you can bill me hourly for it. You can only bill me up to $40,000, right? So you get to that $40,000 mark and you still haven't delivered me that product, right? You may have to spend an extra $20,000 to ultimately deliver that. And it's typically going to be more risky. And how we see this come up is just the structure of the contract itself, of course, but we refer to as risk shifting language, right? So this is going to be things like subject to approval, subject to inspection. So Patricia delivers me the product and I go, no, it doesn't meet the standards. Do it again. I'm not paying you. You already hit your 40,000. So you keep having to incur costs until you ultimately get my approval versus something that doesn't say subject to approval, subject to inspection, subject to a warranty, so on and so forth. That's going to be scaling on the less risky side, right? Those are your gray area contracts. So we often see that in SBIR contracts as well, because it's a sweet spot, for lack of a better term. Everybody likes that one. It does matter for purposes of R&D qualification. What I'll also say is not all projects are under contract. You may be independently developing a product or a project that you are doing that no means is under any particular contract you're doing. You're simply hoping to get it out to the marketplace and commercialize it and make money. But no one's paying you necessarily to do it. You just cite funds, or maybe you just bootstrapped. There's no contract at play. So this entire analysis is not applicable, but it certainly is when we're talking about projects that are undertaken, under a contract or typically through SBIR. But we see this even in commercial settings, right? Vendor one and vendor two, they get into a contractual relationship to develop something. Well, who's holding the economic risk? It's the party that gets to make the claim for the R&D credit activity going on the project. Questions on this? Well, to restate, if you're being awarded these contracts at SBIR, or you're engaging outside companies for, when I say outside companies, I mean commercial companies, non-government entities, it's important to understand the contractual structure. By no means am I saying, oh, change your entire contractual structure so you can claim the R&D credit. It's not necessarily always the case, but it is important to understand that if you're not engaging these contracts under what we deem economically risky contracts for purposes of R&D, all of that work may not be eligible for the R&D tax credit, and may necessarily not be the best case scenario. no means is a bad thing. It just wouldn't be as large of a credit as we'd otherwise see if it were set up in the structure. Okay, so let's move on to what I think is a little simpler. What are some key candidates for the R&D tax credit? Software application, platform development, data migration. We're seeing a lot of this with the AI kind of world taking place, which is why I teed it up. I expect we'll see some guidance be issued by the Treasury about kind of what meets that threshold. What's internal use software versus software that's developed for licensing or kind of selling outwardly to the commercial marketplace. Agriculture, absolutely the case. Food, um, I would say really any botany, all of these agricultural fields are absolutely qualified R&D, so long as they're doing cross genetic work or something of that nature. Um, Manufacturing, it's a classic, right? Product development, it's its truest form, so long as you're developing new products or you're improving existing products. But a lot of manufacturers also do a lot of process improvements, right? Where they're going to deploy new machinery. Now they used to be able to, have 30 widgets come out of their manufacturing line in a day. Now it's 60. Well, that's absolutely a performance improvement, right? That's a unit performance criteria that we talked about for a permitted purpose. When you're integrating that system, is it going to integrate with the other machines that have? Right? There's some uncertainty going on. Let's test it. Process of experimentation. Is it rooted in hard sciences? Absolutely. I want this to be repeatable. Definitely don't want this to be a variable here. So you can see this in manufacturing pretty often. Um, Architecture and design build, absolutely. You're not qualifying the building necessarily, but your the product is what we care about here. The product itself is the ultimate final approved design, right? But these typically uh, go through an iterative process of development because you go to somebody and I say, I want my office to be developed this way, a hospital developed this way, and you know I have to kind of work through this process of getting everything integrated from plumbing all the way to electrical, all the way to the actual structural integrity of said building. And the final product being the ultimate approved design for construction to begin. Of course, civil, structural, mechanical engineering. Uh, some architects will subcontract out, right, to electrical engineering firms, civil design firms. They're going to source that work. And guess what? Here's a very good example of two parties to one R&D eligible project, but they're under a contractual relationship. So who has the risk here, right? Who's required, to pay if they're ultimately successful? It's how we evaluate whether or not that party can then claim the expenses and therefore the expenses associated with calculating the R&D credit. So it's a good example. Of course, biotech and life sciences. I think it's relatively straightforward. What we see here, you can think of things like chemistry, so on and so forth, but this list you're seeing here, not exhaustive at all. I think the marketing example that we pointed out with Trisha is good. It's not even listed here, but companies that are quote unquote not traditionally R&D on its face, they may have sub projects inside their companies that are absolutely R&D driven. So I wanted to point out some key candidates for R&D here, but by no means is it exhaustive at all. Any questions on this? Okay. Well, let's get into the quick math here. The way the R&D credit is calculated, I want to actually do all the numbers here because it can get a little tricky, but the quick reflexive one is um, for every dollar you're spending on R&D, let's just say it's $100,000 R&D expenses that meet four-part test, about 10 to 20% of that number can be R&D credit eligible. And the reason there's a range there is because the R&D credit, I said this a little earlier, the R&D credit is what we refer to as the credit for increasing research activities. So if you are investing more money into your product development, into your process improvements relative to the previous years, so in SBIR contracts, you get awarded phase two, you're getting more money injected into development. Well, that increase in R&D activity spend, it's going to put you to that 20% side, right? Versus Somebody who's kind of has a static level of investment in R&D, it's okay. It just wouldn't give them that kind of maximum 20% threshold, right? So companies with $1 million in R&D spend can be 75,000 up to 115,000. And again, as I pointed out, 10 and 20K for any 100K spend there. Those are good examples. It's also important to understand is these R&D credits, you don't lose them. If you claim them, you're not profitable, you can carry them forward like 20 years. So we typically see this with software companies, for example. Their first years, they're really heavy in software development, but they haven't rolled it out to the marketplace yet. So they're typically not paying taxes yet because of the losses, but they're still doing R&D work. So every year they're making that R&D credit claim. They can't use it, but they're effectively banking those credits. So in the first year, they roll their product out. Shit. They start making a ton of money. First big tax bill comes their way. Well, fortunately, pooling those R&D credits that they been claiming in those previous years all the way forward, and it goes in on a first in, first out basis. It's a nice piggy bank to have. And then in addition to that, though, companies that are true startup companies in their first 5 years, if they're under $5 million in gross receipts, they can use their R&D credits to offset payroll taxes up to $500,000. So again, if you use a software company example, if they are doing all this development, they have employees, sure, they're not paying a federal income tax bill. They're still paying payroll taxes on their employees. So fortunately, they can use their R&D credits to offset some of that, which is an immediate benefit as opposed to kind of sitting on it for a couple of years and hoping they hit profit. This is a very common method, and ideally, I would say one of the most lucrative methods if you fall into the criteria, which again is sub $5 million and in your first 5 years of existence as a company. I would say this is most applicable to SBIR recipients because typically the companies that come on my radar fall into that category. They're usually in year one or two. And so uh, it's a good benefit to have without question. Some additional considerations there, right? It's a great fit for companies with repeatable technical processes. And then, of course, there's a lot of nuances and considerations, things like tracks and some of this work overseas, and so on and so forth. What amount of time is being spent, what kind of documentation exists. And those are all things that can be systematically unpacked. By no means is there a strict documentation. It could be emails from me to somebody else saying, "Okay, we're working through this project. You get through this?" And we're sending formulas back and forth. It's documentation. It's problem solving. Just because you don't have a neat, absolute report on all developments you took isn't perfectly true for making this claim.
Would you recommend like just writing down the hours like in a schedule or something just to keep track of the hours
Yeah,
you
I
spend?
mean, no, that's a great question. I think so. Under 6001 of the tax code, it literally is no specific documentation required. So as long as you have something to show, which is why I pointed out those email examples. But uh, to your point, I think that it's always good to just maybe make a quick note somewhere because at the end of the year, we might have to do a little bit of a memory game, right? Hey, what the first quarter of the year looked like for you? Well, totally changed years, right after March or something like that. And the time changed completely. So I think anytime there's a milestone event, maybe a good time to document something. It can be really light. That'd probably be enough. But I think at the very least, quickly logging how you're spending your time on average. Once a month you do that, I think you're in a good spot. It'll certainly inform you as to how much time we can probably allocate, likely even more. Great question, though. Any other questions here? Okay. So about
I sent a question in text, but if I'm doing contract development for a client, is my activity eligible for R&D credit?
yeah, if you're doing contract development for a client, is your work eligible? Yeah, that's going to come down to the nature of the contractual structure itself, right? So to go back a few slides,
Yeah.
how is that customer paying you? If they say, hey, I'm only paying you if you give me that product, well then yeah, you're the one that's going to be eligible. If it's the other way where they're paying you hourly, then no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So come with the last portion of our time here. We'll talk about some of the R&D specs under current law, what changed and why it matters. I talked a little bit about the timeline. I also talked about Section 174 is the deduction area of research and experimentation. Notice I'm differentiating 174 from R&D by saying research and experimentation versus research and development. Research and experimentation is what we refer to when we talk about Section 174 versus R&D is going to be the credit. Those are just activities-based work. So Section 174 is broader, can lend itself to costs like laboratory costs, only in the sense that it's deductible, not contributing toward the credit calculations. So here, it's neat little gram here, or little Venn diagram here, kind of helps you. It's Section 174 again. So you can take all costs that are incidental to research. Again, where those lines are drawn is somewhat gray. So if these things sound applicable to you, I would highly, highly recommend you talk to a tax professional here. But nonetheless, things like utilities, even attorney's fees for patents, rent, supplies and labor that wouldn't otherwise be eligible for Section 41, maybe because their contractual structure is odd, so you can't make the claim toward the credit. They can nonetheless be depreciated from, they can be taken as a deduction, I'm sorry, to reduce your overall taxable income. Those are costs that are incidental to your research. But there's an impact here. Together they work in conjunction, right? You can take some deductions for things that aren't going towards your R&D credit, which is great. So he's reducing your overall taxable income, simultaneously getting a credit to dollar for dollar offset your total tax liability comes at the end of the year. Or alternatively, use that R&D credit to set payroll taxes in those startup phase companies that I mentioned a few slides ago. So as we move here, we saw this in the Tax Cuts and Job Act from 22 through 24. This got kind of messy, right? Those Section 174 expenses, they all had to be spread out over 5 years. So if I'm spending $1 million on a laboratory, I can only take $100,000 as a deduction, as well as overseas work, 6.5% deductions on spend. It leaves you with a lot of phantom income, and you can still take advantage of the R&D credit, which helps. But with deductions being so significantly reduced, it led to that, again, what I refer to as phantom income. So to give you an idea of what this actually looked like during the time, is here in 2021, kind of go down that column, $1 million in revenue. Just say your investor is giving you $1 million. I spend $1 million on software engineering, labor, right, to QA team, software dev team. I can deduct all of them, right? Profit zero, therefore my tax bill is zero. Don't have any profits, so therefore I can't be taxed on it. 1 year later, same exact fact pattern, but because those deductions couldn't be taken advantage of anymore, you were left over with $900,000 in profit. And then you were suddenly taxed $189,000 in taxes because that's subject to 21% tax rate. So you see how these tax bills paid for those tax cuts, right? For companies, that's kind of what we saw here and what we took place, and that's led to a lot of companies finding themselves in very tricky positions. Maybe they didn't want to invest as much in R&D. Maybe they were not inclined to take advantage of the credit, or some people put their heads in the sand. For very large companies that are publicly traded, they couldn't avoid this. It was a compliance issue. It wasn't optional. It was mandatory. So for anybody on this call, if your company's been in business for a few years, going to Fit 22, I would also recommend, taking a look at that, making sure that these are being properly classified. So you're either taking full advantage of the deductions, or if you were effectively only taking 10% of these deductions and you were left over with a 50 tax bill, there may be a way to reduce that and get that adjusted, if you will. And then kind of as we roll to 2023 at the time, You could take 10% from the previous year, 20% in the next year. You're still left over with $700,000 in profit. You still have a corporate tax bill due. It's a little less. And if you applied an R&D credit in this example of, let's call it 100,000, because taking kind of 10% of a million there, the bill will come down to $47,000, right? It's significant. It's a significant change for them. So it was great and necessary. But conversely, sidebar personal opinion here, I don't think it was the best route here because we effectively de-incentivized innovation. Not an ideal scenario. Fortunately, as we see here, the problem, you can saw why it hurt, and especially, right? These are SBIR, STTR recipients. It could be just commercial startup companies. They're already limited on cash flow. The last thing these companies need is effectively rogue phantom tax bills, right? They're not making any money yet. Yet we're kind of hamstring them with significant tax bills. For an example, I had a client who had to take a loan out to pay their tax bill. It was unheard of for that to happen. Fortunately, that was all fixed, but it was a tough couple of years for quite a few companies that were, I would say, smaller size. So, as scary as this looks, the good news is it's all been fixed, right? So make sure you work with your tax professional to get a better understanding and making sure that you're understanding, rather you're taking advantage of all these benefits that may be available to you. And then what you'll see here is the fix, right? That's what I often refer to it. Signed in July 4th of last year, is now domestic R&D spend that's back to 100%. So if we use that previous example, it would look like 2021 all over again. $1 million in revenue, $1 million in spend, $0 in profit, therefore no tax bill. So we're back. Again, we talked this very early. Some companies can amortize this, and they sometimes do it for sophisticated accounting methods. But if you're a small company, medium size, my recommendation is likely not to take advantage of that. But what did remain was overseas spend. You still have to spread that out over 15 years, and that's a mandatory requirement. So if you are outsourcing any R&D work overseas, be cognizant of that because it is a significant tax burden. And on top of that, if there wasn't ever subject to review or audit, you may get hit with kind of back taxes and penalties. So certainly want to have that conversation with your tax professional if this is applicable to you. Disregard if you're not outsourcing from overseas. I'm moving these slides relatively quick here. So any questions on what I just talked about? Would anybody like me to go back a few slides and kind of jump into anything more? So after the big beautiful bill passed, it said this is fixed, but how do you go about fixing it? Because companies that were amortizing their expenses in 2022 and 2023 and 2024 left these large tax bills, let's go back and fix it. So what this allowed for is this guidance that was issued by the IRS. They said, here's how you're going to go ahead and fix it, right? And just some automatic change procedures. It's called the Form 3115. Professionals familiar with it, don't stress it. But it just means, hey, we're previously amortizing under the new rules, we don't anymore. Again, if this is not something you were doing at all at the time, I would consider just having a conversation so you remain cognizant of any implications from historical years. And so, again, in that same guidance, what they also permitted was, hey, you can go back if you were spreading those expenses out to 22, 23, 24, take that amortization that we were doing and really bring it to the way it should have been, give you that. So long as you are a small business, what the threshold is, the way the IRS defines it, is anything under 31 million, which is always shocking to me that they consider that a small business. But if you're under $31 million and you're amortizing those expenses for R&D, you can go back to those returns and fix them, no problem at all. And the deadline to take advantage, full advantage, I should say, small business retroactive election is July of this year, so it's coming up relatively quickly. It primarily has to do with companies who only are fixing this, but also can take advantage of the R&D credit and plug that in as well, right? This fixed the deduction capabilities on top of that. I was unaware if it claimed the credit. Maybe there's also a refund available for this historical years. So yeah, again, a little bit of critical timeline here, give or take about a month over that. So again, I recommend that you talk to a tax professional in this continue. If you are a company that started in 2025, disregard this essentially. If you would have filed tax returns in those years prior. And then for companies that were larger than 31 million, again, the IRS's guidance said, uh, you know, don't go back and amend those. It's going to get real messy real fast. So just take all those expenses and just move them all the way to the current year so we can kind of get caught up, so to speak.
Interesting.
David, you have a question?
Yeah. Kevin, can we get a copy of these slides?
I will verify with my team that I can send it through, mostly because there's a lot of information on here. Since it's a work product, I'll just make sure, but my goal is to have this sent out. I don't have everybody's email though. So Alejandro, if you're on this call, if you can provide me everyone who's on this call's email address who joined, would be ideal to send this out to everybody who joined.
Thank you.
Of course. So as we make our way toward the end of this presentation, one, I appreciate everyone's attention. Talking tax and all that fun stuff is, again, it can be kind of boring, but I think it's somewhat interesting when we talk about all these nuances and changes that have occurred over the last couple of years. So let's just talk about a practical example. A design build engineering firm, company A engages to develop a new building design with another company, and in doing so, they were undertaking an iterative design process, right? So ensuring quality and reliability of that building based on the specs provided. Also outsourced a geoscience firm because they needed to look at the ground to make sure that structural capability was there because maybe they had to meet earthquake requirements or something of that sort. One, they're going to qualify, right? Because work is absolutely meets the four-part test that we talked about. They're going to be able to take a portion of their employee wages that were involved in this work. So who's supervising it, who's directly doing it, who's directly supporting it, and maybe multiple people, maybe a large team, as well as that geoscience contractor. They're brought in for specialized work to check the soil conditions. Spend can be allocated accordingly toward the R&D credit, as well as fully deductible under Section 174. So there's just a combined result. We got a much larger tax savings as well as a full tax credit. So you can kind of use this company A example and you can swap this with a software company, right? Swap this with a bioscience company, swap this with manufacturer. You can think of a lot of examples that kind of meet this real baseline criteria. And in doing so, the goal really is reduce tax burden, whatever your tax burden may be. Let's get credit so we can even ideally offset it completely. Because the IRS, the government, what we're trying to do is reward innovation. Because by undertaking innovation, you are inherently engaging in risky behavior in the sense that this may not pay off, right? I may throw money at something that doesn't pay off, and the way to recover that is either in the form of deductions or credits or both, right? So keep this in mind because this is a very lucrative benefit. And with it being permanent in the tax code, this also helps a lot of companies forecast and go, I'm going to invest in this project. We're going to put a team of 10 people on it. Their total wages amount to give or take $1 million. Well, I know of that spend, I can probably anticipate $100,000 to $150,000 in credits. Anticipated tax bill somewhere around $200,000. Great. Now we're somewhere around $50,000 in a tax bill. It incentivizes the willingness to engage in a project or engage in a work that they wouldn't otherwise engage. That's the legislative intent is what we refer to as when we talk about the R&D credit. So here's some quick Royce Partners case studies. These numbers can get really big. For a design build engineering firm I conducted, we identified about $2.6 million in wages, contractors, total spend in a given calendar year. They were awarded $201,402 in R&D tax credits. So their total tax bill was reduced significantly. It's effectively freed up capital. Because imagine, at the end of the year comes and you get a tax bill and says, "Hey, send me a, give or take $300,000 to the federal government to pay your taxes." Wait, now I have 201,000, so I'm writing you a check for 99,000 instead. That's a significant tax savings. It effectively frees up capital you otherwise wouldn't have had if you didn't know about this benefit. And then on the right there, you see a software company that had $1.2 million in R&D spend. They were entitled, they got about $93,000 R&D tax credit, very lucrative benefit for them as well. And the very nature of R&D for software, really any industry, is it's carrying over through the years, right? So you might get $93,000 this year. Maybe next year it's 100,000. Maybe next year it's 80,000. Nonetheless, it's still a lucrative benefit that they're taking advantage of. It's in every single year that you're taken advantage of, so long as the activities are still being undertaken. Some projects span multiple years, especially SBIR contracts. It may take you a year plus to get through the prototype phase, and then the phase 2 may take you 3 years. Let's take advantage of those credits every single year that we can. So kind of final thoughts here as we wrap up today's presentation. Let's say the R&D credit is more valuable than ever, especially after what I refer to as the legislative fix with respect to the amortization requirements, because deductions are fully restored. And in doing so, it's very good to go retroactive, take a look back at historically filed tax returns, and make sure that you're taking advantage of these credits that you are potentially entitled to. Some taxpayers who pause their work or reduce the amount of money they spend on R&D, maybe they are inclined now to restart. So how do you recommend that? Of course, if you move your claims, as long as you're engaging in reoccurring development. I know there's only a few listed there: software engineering and life sciences. The list goes on, right? It's not an exhaustive list. So highly recommend just take a deeper dive on this and work with a tax professional, reach out to specialized firms. These are very lucrative benefits that effectively can be lifelines for small size companies, because they're the ones that typically get hit with a tax bill that it's hard to navigate when capital's already on a thin line, so to speak. So keep that in mind as you are undertaking new projects or maybe being awarded new contracts. So right on here, any final questions, final thoughts? That concludes today's presentation. I was slated for 2 hours, want to allocate give or take 15 minutes for Q&A. But if there isn't that many questions, we can wrap up early and give everyone some time back. So I'll pause here. Any questions for me? Any examples anybody would like to talk about as well?
Given I posted in the chat link to the New Mexico's economic development website for New Mexico specific tax credits, a variety of resources that are in one nice place.
Nice.
Another resource that's available is the JTIP program, Job Training Incentive Plan, which isn't the R&D tax credit, but it's related to salaries. And you can get, I think you can get reimbursed up to 55% of a professional salary for a certain amount of time. I think it's a 6-month period of time, roughly.
Yeah.
And there's rules to follow. There's hurdles to overcome. But
Sure.
Once you have a system in place to track that information, it's very much worth it, because it's not a tax credit; it's cash back to the company.
It's a refund. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's been, and what's nice is that you're not following economic development department's training plan. You develop the training plan, they approve it, and then you follow your own training plan. And so
Right.
the training plan you develop is specific to your company. It's not a generic thing that you have to fit your company into.
No, I appreciate you sharing that, Mark. And I think that that's another good example where we're effectively talking about R&D tax credits, but there are things that, as we all know, state tax credit bills. About 34 states have their own specific R&D credit programs. Some are particularly unique, but most adopt the federal framework. So if you qualify for the federal R&D credit, chances are you're going to qualify for the state-specific R&D credit, should there be one. Since this is New Mexico adjacent, if you will, I will say that New Mexico has a very lucrative R&D tax credit. But what's unique about New Mexico is it's what we refer to as an application-based state. So you submit your application for the activities that you conducted in a particular year, and so long as it gets approved, which ideally it would be if you're working with a tax professional in that case, credit is refundable. So if you apply for a credit for $50,000, you receive a significant return. But you cannot go back to previous years for New Mexico. It's a single year only, where you apply that year and you apply next year, so on and so forth. You can't retroactively apply. So keep in mind that state benefits exist, and it can be lucrative as well. And just like Mark said, there's other incentive programs that exist at state level that should really be taken advantage of to free up capital where you can. Any other final thoughts or questions?
So I'm sorry, I'm working on a project now, but with my company in the future, I would like to develop new products. And would I follow the same metric for the research and development path, like calculating which time I spend and finding the efficacy route, and that would qualify as research and development, if I'm understanding it?
Yeah, I've worked with companies, think about project X, project Y, project Z. So if you want to classify that as a project, maybe you're in the conceptual development phase, right? Well, that is the initial phase for any project to kind of get off the ground, so to speak. So I would say that kind of start separating that category and allocating accordingly. But I don't want you to spend more time figuring out the time you spend on this versus actually doing the work, right? Because we can figure the other part out a lot easier than you completing that work. But I think it's very important to flesh out the fact that they're essentially two separate projects if they are, just so they can be called out, talked about, written in a narrative form, if you will, to say, this is why this meets that 4-part test criteria, and this is why it's R&D eligible, I should say.
But it would still qualify whether, even if future projects don't yield the same results as the initial project.
As in, like, it changes, as in it changes, or change gears, or takes a different route. Is that what you're referring to, Trisha?
I mean, like, I know the product that I currently have works because I've been teaching it for 6 years, but I would like to develop other products, and I guess do the same round of testing to see how well they do as standalone products, how well they do with additional instruction, and test to see and try to find answers to see how well it works in each condition.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think using your initial product is fine, it's more than fun, as long as you're in the process of experimentation stuff, right? Because sometimes we see, I have a project over here that I've completed that's my go-to. I'm kind of repackaging it for a different use case. So there's not much process of experimentation. There's not much uncertainty there. But if you're taking that as your baseline product and you want to introduce some new capabilities to it, maybe a performance improvement, a new functionality improvement, well, by definition, you're going to have to tinker with it. For lack of a better term, there's going to be a process of experimentation. It will be sufficient. So by all means, that is something absolutely worth exploring. But great questions. Thank you, Trisha.
Thank you.
Yeah. On here, as you can see on the screen, feel free to email me. There's my line, the website. So if any questions that come up, you want to talk about your company specific, despite being an attorney, I do not bill hourly for initial calls or anything like that. So again, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to provide any guidance where I can. If individuals are curious of any good CPA recommendations, whether it be locally or otherwise, happy to always serve as a resource to anybody on this call and otherwise. So feel free to always reach out.
Hey everybody, hello. Can you
Yes,
guys hear me?
sure can.
So I'm a founder. I'm working on a company, and I gave up on this idea, but I'm doing it again. And I need help with like somebody who can guide me with navigating the legal bound ways and some funding. I'm working. All I know is like to how to build and do the product, and I'm working on it.
Mhm.
With other things, I need help.
Yeah. I mean, as somebody who works with founders and startups and engineers of all types, it's often where they need the help. I proclaim to be an engineer, wouldn't know where to begin in such as this is. So if that's something that you need assistance with, feel free to reach out. Whether it's not me, I assure you, I have the resources available to point you in the right direction. But we want to certainly narrow down the exact list of things that you need help with, whether it be entity formation, entity type, tax positioning, so on and so forth. So feel free to reach out to that email that you see there on screen.
Thank you.
Of course. Any final questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well,
Great
9
job.
minutes.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. You're very, very welcome. I'll try the slide deck out to everybody. Thanks for bringing that up. Otherwise, everyone enjoy the rest of your, gosh, what is it? Wednesday? Yeah, it's a short week because of Memorial Day. So everyone, have a great rest of your week. Feel free to reach out if you need anything. I appreciate everyone's time this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And again, feel free to reach out, but you all.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Right. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.